for this. Worksheet number 7 for next week will be extra credit. And so just a heads up, and I'll make sure to add that little descriptor after class. So again, focus on your Exodus survey. You guys reading that you guys have coming up in a couple weeks. I don't think it's on here, but we have another quiz there. And for those of you that took the first one, you will know well the questions that come on there that will show up related to reading, and then a few content questions as well. So are there any questions thus far over the past couple weeks, the coming next couple weeks? All right. And again, I know a few emails have been coming in about late work. With the stuff for late work, if you give me a heads up, that's all I really need to know. Hey, some things came up and I'll be turning my work in late. That's fine. And so again, the goal for me is always your guys' learning and you guys' engagement with the material. And so if you guys give me a heads up, that's fine. So don't necessarily feel like you have to necessarily ask for permission, as much as just sending me a heads up with any late work that you might be turning in. So just wanted to remind you guys of that. So if you guys go ahead as we get lecture started for this afternoon, we're going to have to go through quite a bit, and I'm going to try to get through it as calmly, but as hopefully as effective as possible, because we have a bit to get through specifically with Exodus. There is some bits and pieces that I'm going to want to start off at, but before I do that, have you guys run into any questions or any issues as you're reading through the text or as you're reading through any of the readings that you've been assigned thus far? Okay. Well, hopefully as we continue to talk through today and we engage, and you guys will notice very quickly, Exodus is my jam. I roll with Exodus every time. You guys will see my expressiveness with specifically with this specific test and just getting pumped because there's just so much here in Exodus for us to explore, to engage with, to wrestle with, to grapple with, and especially as it concerns our relationship with God and our understanding of God. So a few things we're going to go through today. Introducing Exodus, talking about the Yahweh and Pharaoh, little spat that they have in the book of Exodus, and talking about the plagues. It is my goal to be able to get through something like 16 chapters and talk about the content. And again, if you guys do have any questions, stop me at any moment. I will go through the introduction pretty quick. Again, just I want to spend more time here at Yahweh and Pharaoh and the plagues, mostly because you guys already are there in reading and talking about it. So I want to make sure to cover as much ground here that will prove helpful for your understanding, especially as you're reading for this next week. So with the way Exodus is laid out, you'll see it in two chunks. One of them is the departure from Egypt, which is the Exodus proper, and then the journey to and arrival at Mount Sinai. Journey and arrival to Mount Sinai. Sinai kind of breaks up into two chunks. One is that law or teaching, and that's where you have what is called the 10 Commandments or the 10 words, as you guys will see why when we get there, why I call it the 10 words. And then the actual building of the tabernacle. This first chunk can be broken up into three parts. You have what is the prelude, and I'll spend a pretty good amount of time at the prelude because so much of what it sets up for the rest of the text, especially with the plagues. A lot of ideas will be introduced here, like who is Yahweh, the person of Pharaoh, issues having to do with oppression, the contrast between Yahweh and Pharaoh that will again set up the context of what we call the plagues. And then the actual departure out of Egypt. And that second half goes between Mount Sinai, again with that law and teaching, and the tabernacle. The important part to see here, one, is to note what will become a reoccurring theme if you haven't already noticed, is that there's the theme of grace coming before law. And what I mean by that is that you don't have this demand to covenant faithfulness, specifically with Mosaic covenant, given before they're delivered from the Egyptians. You don't have the demand for obedience until after they're brought out of Egypt. And this is really important for us to recognize, especially when we start talking about tabernacle, when God will dwell with the people. Because the reason for the Exodus, the reason for this covenant that God will commit himself to and invite Israel into, will be for the purposes of relationship. Recovering that original vision from Genesis chapter 1 and 2, where God is present with his people in a place. And then next week when we talk about we'll talk about more with the 10 words, the 10 commandments, and then tabernacle, specifically the grace that is demonstrated here, and Yahweh first giving his people a teaching on how to be his people, and second, Yahweh instructing the people both in terms of maintaining relationship with himself, but then also how to participate in the act of worship, which again is part of their obligation in being a delivered people. And so as we get into Exodus, I do want to read, we'll be stopping off at a few passages here as we take a look. Does anybody want to read this? Exodus 1, 5 through 10.
I'll read it.
Do it.
The total number of people born in Jacob was 70. Joseph was already in Egypt. Then Joseph died, and all his brothers and that whole generation. But the Israelites were fruitful and prolific. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. Now a new king arose over Egypt, who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, "Look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase, and in the event of war, join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land."
Beautiful, beautifully read. There's a few things that I want to help point out for us. I had brought up a couple weeks ago, because I know everybody remembers every word that I've said, that a lot of the way the Joseph story functions is to get us from Canaan down into Egypt. And here, well, again, we're given a little bit of an introduction into the Hebrews that are now in the land of Egypt. There's a few words that I want us to pay attention to. We take a look here as they're settling in Egypt. So Joseph died and all his brothers and the whole generations. The Israelites were fruitful and prolific, or maybe we could even say they were fruitful and multiplied. What other place in the Bible do we see that kind of language?
In Genesis.
Attaboy, where at? Talk to me about
it. When God appeared to Abraham and said, "Be fruitful and multiply."
Yep. That's one place. Where's that? Where's another place before that?
Oh, Adam and Eve.
There you go. There you go. Can't hog them all, Christian. Exactly. So there's this continuity between Genesis and Exodus. The kind of living out of this vocation that are given to these early humans about populating the earth. But again, that promise given to Abraham doesn't take thousands upon thousands of years. It becomes actualized within these people who are down in Egypt, that they are multiplying, growing strong, so that the land was filled with them. Abraham's descendants are starting to fill up. But against that, a new king rose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And this right here is really important for us to understand, that did not know Joseph. It has much less to do with lack of information, more so it has to do with broken relationship. There's a broken relationship between Pharaoh and Joseph, which as a representative, and by extension, the people of Israel, which again leads to the oppression brought on by paranoia. Again, lack of relationship. Broken relationship between Pharaoh and the people of Egypt through Joseph will commence the suffering. It will bring about a suffering. And so again, seen against the context of what's happening here as the people are multiplying, those, specifically Pharaoh, who did not know Joseph, this kind of broken relationship between Pharaoh and the people of Israel will lead towards the oppression in Egypt, which God will deliver them from. So you do have some themes that are coming up here. That slavery and deliverance, that deliverance from slavery is, and I brought this up before, it was the basis on which the law or Torah is given. And this is really important, especially when we get to Deuteronomy, when Yahweh's command is going to be remember. Remember, remember, remember. And the specific instance that they are to remember is the Exodus event. The Exodus event. And it's this event that then becomes a matter of ethics for people later on. That be merciful, be compassionate, for the Lord your God was merciful to you in bringing you out of the land of the Egyptians. And so again, much of the motivations in both in Leviticus and in Deuteronomy will be based on God's activities, based on God's character demonstrated in and through the Exodus event. And the issue of ownership of the land, which resulted in the issue of worship. And those of you that have taken cultures will know that you have you have deities that often inhabited specific locations. That you have Baal, who's god of the Canaanites, Asherah, who's also in the land of Canaan, probably closer. And then you have Philistine, who's Magog. You have specific deities that belong to specific regions. But what you have here, and what we'll start to see get teased out, is one, issues related to land, and other issues related to which deity or which king will be dominant in a specific region. And again, we'll see that when we start talking about Pharaoh in Yahweh. And so I brought this up before, but you have the Israelites that are fruitful and multiplied. There's a bunch of them down there, which causes Pharaoh to get paranoid. And the one thing Pharaoh is worried about is a kind of partnership, a rebellion with foreign enemies. With foreign enemies, that they should team up with foreign powers in order to overthrow Pharaoh. Again, Pharaoh's concern is about the consolidation and protection of power. So what does he use? Oppression. And not just any general kind of oppression, but state-mandated, state-ordered slave labor. And that what he orders is the building of cities of Pithom and Ramses. Again, what these cities would often do is that they would be places for holding for either agricultural, economic, or military goods and services. Places to keep horses and chariots and whatnot. But as we continue to move on through Exodus, we're going to run into a few characters. Again, the reason why we're going to be reading through a few of these stories is to set up, again, so much of the prologue that will help us to better understand the Exodus event, especially as it's related to this contest between Yahweh and Pharaoh. But even before we get into the plagues, we have these characters that serve as these foils to Pharaoh. I oftentimes bring up that it's important to pay attention to characters. And I brought up a few weeks ago the importance of paying attention to female characters in the story as they are specifically mentioned, because oftentimes the female characters will prove to be I don't want to say necessarily the heroes of the story, but they serve as exemplars within the stories, contrasted often with the fallible male characters. And especially here is what we're going to find with these two women contrasted with Pharaoh. And so that being said, does anybody want to read this specific passage?
I can read it.
Do it.
The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, when you act as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a boy, kill him. If it is a girl, she shall live. But the midwives feared God. They did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but they let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, why have you done this and allowed the boys to live? The midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families.
Perfect. Thank you. Beautiful. So again, you have the presence of these two women that engage in activities, what we might call civil disobedience. You have these female characters at the outset, first ones that are contrasted with Pharaoh. That while Pharaoh tries to destroy life, it's these women who go against the rules, go against the grain, and save lives. Specifically, again, of the oppressed Hebrew boys. Hebrew children. If slavery wasn't bad enough, guess what? Let's try to kill them. Kill off the kids. Specifically the males, because again, they would be oftentimes be enlisted in militaristic service. And so again, another way to consolidate power is to kill off the vulnerable. But instead, these two women who serve as again as foils to Pharaoh, and in the end save lives, in contradiction to what Pharaoh's orders are. But I do want to at least press pause on this a little bit, give it a few minutes for us to think about. Most specifically, because the Old Testament does I don't want to say confuse things, but it's not always so black and white in terms of ethics and the proper activities of an individual, especially in relationship to evil and specific demands that seem contrary. That you have midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, they're vigorous and give birth. That you have this kind of emphasis on fearing God. And because the Hebrew midwives feared God, he gave them families. But what that fear looks like civil disobedience. And what are we to say, or at least what can be said if we allow Exodus to speak to us in our time and speak to us about the kind of favor that Yahweh grants, especially with those who go against the rules. And again, I make the rules a little bit ambiguous because I want us to think more so about the content of the rules that we're talking about. And what kind of actions seem to be more in line with faithful participation and faithful obedience to Yahweh, more so than just kind of going along to get along. Or just to be a rebel because I don't like that. Because again, there is a kind of blessing with them lying to him. And the only reason I say lying is because they did not do as the king of Egypt commanded, but let the boys live. So that's where we get that from. Well, what the text doesn't say they're lying, but what they did do is that they let them live. What have you done this? Why have you done this and allowed the boys to live? That it was by these women's participation that the boys were allowed to live. Well, one of the things I want us to consider is, I know it's 2 weeks that we've been back, and it's a Monday afternoon when we all want to take a nap. One of the things I do want us to consider, and I think now having a nephew, and we just visited him, I think like a week ago or so. We had masks on and stuff like that, so we were safe. But Any of you who have held a newborn know how absolutely and positively vulnerable a newborn is. They got no defense. They got no defense. They can't even protect themselves from their mama's milk. If it's got a little too much spice, their belly's gonna hurt. And what these women do and the extent that they go to out of, again, this kind of fearing God, despite the commands of what Pharaoh is telling them to do, that the move away from fearing a ruler for the sake of protecting the vulnerable seems to be something that God finds favorable. And that the motivations of our civil disobedience, it does matter. Absolutely matters when we act and we participate in the defense, again, of the most vulnerable. And this isn't a pro-life speech as much as it is for us to pay attention and have our eyes open to, again, then when we choose to contend for those that are most vulnerable, we participate in a faithfulness that, one, reflects God's concerns for the vulnerable in the world. And you see that a lot, especially with Leviticus and Deuteronomy, and God's care and concern for the poor and making sure they're fed, especially those that are economically disadvantaged. But that the protection of life that begins, again, with children, but extends all the way through caring for our neighbors as well. That all throughout our lives, and again, this has very little to do with kind of pro-life, pro-choice rant, as much as it does have to do with the concerns in which we share that reflect God's concerns that promote life for every individual, regardless of whether they're a newborn or they're an elderly person. But that we choose to contend for the things which lead to life for each individual, wherever life can be had. And so again, what Yahweh will go to do, and which we'll find that out in a few chapters, and the way God responds in delivering his people doesn't just mean spiritual deliverance, but it means deliverance in real time. Actual, real flesh and blood, bones, everything kind of deliverance out from the hands of oppressors. So whether it's helping helping babies, getting people out of sex trafficking, helping to feed children of single mothers, helping to develop a better educational or economic systems within your neighborhoods, all that kind of work which leads to life and oftentimes can get us into trouble sometimes. It's these kinds of things that seem to be Yahweh's concerns. And that we might be more faithful participants if we should sometimes go against the system a little bit, have to work against the systems. So, again, I don't want to move on from this too quickly, but are there any thoughts, questions, comments, concerns? And so again, this concept is, again, it's a big concept that has huge ramifications if we so choose to allow this kind of text and this kind of thinking about, again, preserving life wherever it may be found and working towards the flourishing of life in every aspect of it for all people. But again, especially for the most vulnerable. Man, y'all are talkative today. I like it. All right. Exodus 2. I'll go ahead and read through it real quick because I don't want to spend too much time on this. Now, a man from the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman, very specific. The woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a fine baby, she hid him 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and plastered it with bitumen and pitch. And she put the child in it and placed it among the reeds on the bank of the river. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. So we should find it somewhat ironic that you have this Levite woman that essentially does what Pharaoh told her to do, which is to throw these babies into the sea or into the rivers. Because you have this command right at the end of chapter 1 that says, hey, there's too many of them around. So any baby boy that's born, throw him in the water. And that's exactly what Moses' mom does here. And we'll find out why this is impactful for us. But one of the things I do want to bring up, we brought up one tie back to Genesis with being fruitful and multiply. The English is a little bit misleading for us. Some of your translations might say a good baby or a beautiful baby or some kind of allusion to the child being good looking. But literally in Hebrew, you have that when Moses' mom sees him, she sees that he's a tov baby or a good baby. And again, where else in Genesis, when somebody sees something and calls it tov or good, where else do we find that kind of language? Think back to Genesis.
Was it back during the creation?
Yep. God sees creation and calls it good. So again, there's these notes of God doing something here creatively new with the life of Moses. And then when she couldn't hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and plastered with bitumen and pitch. Again, this is misleading again because it's not just a papyrus basket, but a specific word in Hebrew that is used for an ark. And again, I know they use gopher wood and different kinds of wood, but again, that word here is the same as word used for ark, in which that again, on the inside, bitumen and pitch, a little bit of tar on the inside just to make sure no water gets in. And I don't need to probably bring it up for you guys to recall the story of Noah in the flood and how God delivers Noah and his family through the waters, of course, using a medium or vehicle to get them through it. But again, this significant beginning will have ramifications both for Moses and for Israel. You have Moses, whose birth isn't accompanied by some kind of supernatural phenomena or announcement the way his great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandpas were. Isaac and Jacob, no kind of like, thus saith the Lord's, just Hebrew dude or the Levite dude, Levite woman, they have a baby. Very normal kind of thing. Born to the tribe of Levi, who's hidden in what we call an ark or a teva. And that Moses' own name given to him means the Mashah, or to draw out, or to draw from, to pull from. Because as we know, Moses is pulled from the waters. But this not only highlights the nature of Moses' beginning, but will highlight the nature by which God will deliver the Israelites and how God will draw out the Israelites from Egypt through water. Again, there's a kind of double entendre that's happening there between Moses' name and the act by which God will soon perform by drawing out the Israelites from the land of Egypt. What was Moses' intention by putting him in the river? What, like it was just a subtle way of putting it in God's hands. It seems that she does desire to preserve him in some kind of way, especially by putting him in a basket. That the likelihood of him being able to get away and kind of to hide him out somewhere. And I don't know, the way that he's found rather, at least in the text, he's found rather quickly, does seem to have some kind of illusion that maybe she's kind of low key like sliding him knowingly, unknowingly towards Pharaoh's daughter, because Moses' mom ends up being the one who nurses Moses until he's good and doesn't need to to be nursed anymore. And so there again, there does seem to be some clever tact by Moses's mom by putting him in the ark there, little baby ark. And so little is known about Moses' childhood other than his tutoring as Pharaoh's kid. Again, him living in the palace would have made an education, specifically in Egyptian culture, very accessible to him. And speaking of Egyptians and living in Pharaoh's house, we aren't necessarily completely sure on who Pharaoh is, and you will have read up on this, that there's no necessarily definitive answer. But what does seem to be happening, and it's the one that, again, at least makes the most sense to me, is what is happening there is that Pharaoh not being named is actually a literary device. And this was common in ancient Near Eastern literature, where you would leave out the name of a king or other leader that you wanted to shame. And so, again, with the way that the text is telling the story about this character who's being contrasted with Yahweh, that this literary device of not naming an enemy is meant to bring Pharaoh down, bring him down a peg. But from archaeological research and historical research, it's likely Ramses II or Ramses II. There's often I could say Ramses from Nacho, I'll use it. He built large structures, and it kind of fits the time period. Depending, again, a lot of this depends on how you date the Exodus event. And what I mean by that isn't so much taking it out on a Friday night as much as it is where you place the actual event having occurred. Whether or not it's in the 1400s BCE or whether it's in the 1200s BCE. Again, either, because again, the archaeological evidence can allude to either one, but it's very likely that it's the largely agreed upon is Ramses II. And the fact that there was a change in Pharaoh, because specifically after the 10th plague, you see a kind of change in what's happening there. Let me see how much. Okay, we're almost there. So after Moses ends up growing up, we see a turn specifically in Moses, and this is what, of all the people for God to pick, this does seem to have, this is where it gets a little bit unusual, in that Moses seems to have a kind of fieriness or a kind of temper to him that kind of launches him off the handle from time to time. And we see that kind of first occurrence when Moses sees a Hebrew who's being beaten. And with the way the text frames it is that Moses sees one of his own countrymen, one of his own people. And it's really important for us to see what the text is doing there by saying that Moses is identifying himself as one of the Hebrews, despite growing up as one of Pharaoh's sons. Again, those of you that have seen The Prince of Egypt have seen some of those dynamics at play. It's kind of father-son tension. And that the function of this story, again, is to illustrate even the most raw characteristics and qualities of the person of Moses. But after killing this Egyptian, I won't say a leader, but a kind of a government representative, he's a wanted man, condemned to death by authorities. Pharaoh's trying to hunt him down, where he flees into the wilderness. But at the end of chapter 2, as Moses is in the wilderness, we have a phrase which, again, I want us to be able to dig into as we talk, and again, we continue through the kind of prologue that sets up the Exodus event. And does anybody want to read this part? Read 2:23 to 25.
I can read it.
Do it.
After a long time, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned under their slavery and cried out. Out of the slavery, their cries for help rose to God. God heard their groaning, and God remembered this covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God looked upon the Israelites, and God took notice of them.
Good. Beautiful. There's, again, I do this a lot, but there's words we got to pay attention to. Groaning, cried out, cried for help, groaning. Again, this activity by the Israelites that the author is trying to heighten the tension before God is about to show up. And then God, this is, for those of you that are either have taken BLE or going to take practicum, this is really important to recognize as kind of an interpretive practice, especially when verbs are in succession. It's going to be really important to note. God hears their groaning. God remembers his covenant. God looks upon the Israelites, and then God takes notice. Sandwiched in the middle here is this God remembering his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And that's why it's so important for us to know and to have memorized some of these covenants, specifically with Abraham, because those get passed on, to Isaac and Jacob. And we talked about the 3 P's related to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You guys remember what those were? Talked about them in Biblet too.
People,
People.
promise. Yeah, there you go.
People what? So people?
Promise, place.
Promise and place? Not so much. Place, yeah, but there's one more.
Prosperity.
Prosperity, no. People, place. There's one more.
Presence.
Presence. There you go. Presence. People, place, and presence. The promise of descendants, people. The land I will show you, the land of Canaan, the place, and then presence. I will be your God, and they will be my people, my weeples. And so this promise given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, it's what God remembers before his activity. And before we think that God's an old dude that just happens to have a bad memory, we got to kind of dig into what that means. Because again, it's Hebrew and they put things oddly sometimes. But when God shows up, then nothing has improved since Moses has left. Nothing's improved. Again, they're crying out, they're groaning. It's finals week. Everybody's at it. Again, which is why I pointed out this kind of 4 references to Israel's cry and this 2-fold reference to bondage, their being in slavery. That the issue, that the author is trying to make the issues as clear for us to understand. And then God's response, that God heard, that God took heed of or pays attention to. God remembers. And this is important for us, again, because you're going to see this word come up a lot. Whether it's in the Psalms, when the authors are going to tell God to, hey, remember your people, remember your promise, remember the covenant that you made to your people, or Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That it's the command or the demand, when it depends on where it's coming from, but at least here, when God remembers, it's this kind of obligation that God has to his prior commitment. And again, it has much less to do with forgetting as much as it has to do with this note that God is about to act, which again, when you see in the Psalms, and for the psalmist to demand, hey, God, remember your covenant, remember your people, it's a demand for God to act. It's a demand for God to act based on a prior commitment. And then God sees that God's moving with compassion, which we'll bring up again when we get to chapter 3. And then God knows that God has a sharing of experience with the people and seeing their plight in Egypt. Which again brings us to Exodus 3. Anybody want to read this part?
I can read it.
Do it.
Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led his flock beyond the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. He looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. Then Moses said, I must turn aside and look at this great sight and see why the bush is not burned up. When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Come no closer. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. He said further, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God.
Yeah, I believe there's more. Let me go ahead and get that.
You want me to read the rest of this too? Then the Lord said, I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians and to bring them up out of the land, out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the country of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. The cry of the Israelites has now come to me. I have also seen how the Egyptians oppress them. So come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? He said, I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that it is I who sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God on this mountain.
Excellent. And there's another text here, but I'll go ahead and read through this part because there's some parts that I need to stop off at. But Moses said to God, If I come to the Israelites and say to them, The God of your ancestors has sent me to you, and they ask me, What is his name? What shall I say to them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. That's always a great answer. It is what it is. And he said further, Thus you shall say to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, Thus you shall say to the Israelites, The Lord, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is my title for all generations. Go and assemble the elders of Israel and say to them, The Lord, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob, has appeared to me, saying, I have given heed to you and what has been done to you in Egypt. I declare that I will bring you up out of the misery of Egypt. I know, however, that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless compelled by a mighty hand. So I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all my wonders that I will perform in it. After that, he will let you go. And so we're pretty familiar with this story. If you've spent any short amount of time in church, you'll be familiar with the story of the burning bush. And even if not, there's references to it. But this is what we call Moses's call narrative, where Moses is being called. That you have in the text here, this kind of twofold phrase here. This Moses, Moses, that anticipates a call narrative, and this Moses, Moses, here I am. You'll see that a lot with the prophets as well. And so, but the place where God meets Moses isn't in a temple. It's not when Moses was reflecting on the deep things or taking a look at his life. No, it's when he's in this wasteland, because that's literally what Horeb means. That Moses is on the run from the law, having just killed a man. And this is what we call when God makes it happen. I'll post it in the chat here. There you go. Theophany. And we brought this up before, but a kind of appearance or a manifestation of the divine. But what often happens with these manifestations, and we can get so caught up with the nature of the theophany or the nature of this burning bush, as Moses does. But what's more important always in these kinds of supernatural events is what these events are pointing towards. And that what this burning bush is pointing towards is the revealing of God's name, which is integrally tied to this Exodus event. And that the emphasis throughout this narrative is on God's initiative. The emphasis is on God's initiative throughout the text. And that there's something worth noting here specifically about holiness. And oftentimes we could think it's something that is like set apart or separate, set aside, called out, however we might want to think of it. But rather it's a kind of uniqueness that God has that invites human participation. It doesn't just push it away. It invites participation and not just a kind of pushing away of things that are different or opposite, whatever it might be. The God's holiness is one that invites in. And so you'll see in this class and in your readings, the name Yahweh will come up in these two manners. You'll see here without the vowels, specifically the A and the E. And here it'll be spelled out. Scholars have spent a lot of time trying to figure this out and what it means, because in the manuscripts, scribes conceived that God's name was too holy to have it fully written down. And so what they ended up doing is that they left off the vowel points. So we're not actually super sure what's in the middle. But what we do have in Hebrew is a YH Vav, or Yod He Vav He. Let me go ahead and do something really quick so you guys can see. Let me go ahead and pull it up so you guys can take a look at what it looks like in Hebrew, because there's going to be something tied in with the name that I'm going to want to bring up. Let me do this. Okay, I'm not finding it the one I usually use. Okay. There we go. And all right, there you go. I found it. Let me share this with you guys so you can see. There you go. So this is what we have in Hebrew, and if you're ever taking time to read through it, you'll see this name appear with vowel points. Then again, don't spend so much time up here because this is really uncommon. You probably won't find this very much. You'll see something that looks closer to this. The reason why I bring that up is that God's name, as revealed in Exodus 3, comes from the word to be or will be. That condensed within these two is to be or will be. Let me see if I have it. Oh, there you go. And so the pronunciation, even though uncertain, there is again a relationship between how God is giving his name to the Hebrews and the connection between his name and the event which is about to occur, because you will see in different translations, it'll say, I am who I am, or I will be who I will be, or it'll say, I will be who I am, or I am who I will be. Again, all these different renderings, because it's possible, legitimately possible for the word to have that range of meanings. But again, the intention here is for God to communicate both this personal relationship that Yahweh has with the people, specifically Moses, and then Israel again by extension, and that the revealing of God's name as one tied in with Israel's deliverance from the land of Egypt. The Yahweh is introducing himself as a God of grace, again, starting, and I would fair to say it's even both, even before that, before Exodus 20, of the promise of relationship, even before any expected response, that God delivers the Israelites even before the demand for covenant. That we might even go so far to say that God takes risks with rolling the dice in delivering Egypt, not knowing for certain whether or not that they will commit themselves to him. Because again, the text doesn't make that certain. And that in Exodus 20, that God's commitment to Israel is fixed and immutable. Fixed and immutable, at least from Yahweh's side. And as we'll come to find out, that gets tested a lot by Israel. And the Yahweh is jealous. And when we usually say jealous, what we can get confused with is a kind of the jealousy that we can experience as humans, usually coming from either kind of insecurity, a feeling of inadequacy, some kind of arrogance or pride that we might feel to defend ourselves. But that's not necessarily what's happening here. But that what Yahweh is jealous about and for is a unique monogamous relationship with Israel. And the reason why I say monogamous is that because of the link between idolatry and prostitution, which is the biblical, which is, again, is a biblical concept. Again, especially as we think in terms of covenant, then idolatry starts to make sense why it's linked to prostitution, or it's linked to kind of unfaithfulness because of covenant commitments. And so again, even if it's not necessarily perfectly clear, so I know for my name, Dominic means, it has a range of meanings. Those of you that know Spanish, Domingo just means Sunday, which is a Spanish rendering, but comes from the Latin word Dominus, again, Sunday again. But it ended up having a range of meanings anywhere from of the Lord to child born on Sunday. And most of you know that your name has a certain derivative where it comes from, but that the kind of ambiguity that comes along with God's name. That the precise pronunciation and the meaning of it is unclear, but what is clear is a relationship between God's name and his role as relational deliverer for and to Israel. That God is the one who reveals what his name means. Before I move on too quick, are there any questions, comments, concerns about that?
Real quick, you said it was a relation to being a deliverer to his people or something like that?
Relational deliverer, specifically to
Okay.
Israel. Relational deliverer. Again, that's not what the name necessarily means, as much as that's the link between the name Yahweh and the activity of relational deliverance. that Yahweh is known by. Which again, it does set for us. It set you, if your brain wandered to the New Testament with Jesus specifically, it's very easy to get there because you start seeing some of the overtones. If you know the name Yeshua, it means salvation or deliverance. But again, we don't need to go to the New Testament to do that, because we see it here how God's name is associated with the deliverance event in the Exodus. So all you need is the Old Testament, baby. That's all you need. And so Exodus 5. Does anybody want to read this?
Yeah, I'll read it.
Do it, Jasper.
Afterward, Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go, so that they may celebrate a festival to me in the wilderness." But Pharaoh said, "Who is the Lord, that I should heed him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." Then they said, "The God of the Hebrews has revealed himself to us. Let us go 3 days' journey into the wilderness to sacrifice to the Lord our God, or he will fall upon us with pestilence or sword." But the king of Egypt said to them, "Moses and Aaron, why are you taking the people away from their work? Get to your labors." Pharaoh continued, "Now they are more numerous and the people of the land than the people of the land, and yet you want them to stop working." That same day, Pharaoh commanded the taskmasters of the people as well as their supervisors, "You shall no longer give the people straw to make bricks, as before. Let them go and gather straw for themselves. But you shall require of them the same quantity of bricks as they have made previously. Do not diminish it, for they are lazy. That is why they cry. Let us go and offer sacrifice to our God. Let heavier work be laid on them. Then they will labor at it and pay no attention to deceptive words."
Good. So you'll take notice. Okay, God's in the mix. Things are going to get better, right? Not really. Things kind of get worse. But what we have here in this text, as things are getting worse, is a question that I do want for us to think about and wrestle with. So one of the questions that Pharaoh brings up is that in the response, "Who thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go." But Pharaoh said, "Who is the Lord? Who is this God that I should heed him and let Israel go?" Note that this isn't so much a curiosity as much as it is a rhetorical challenge. It is not a curiosity as much as it is a rhetorical challenge. Those of you that have competed in any kind of way, shape, or form, you'll know that if somebody new walks on the court, walks on the field, walks on the ice or the mat, and whether it be dance or anything else, somebody shows up being competitive or somebody starts talking smack, who's this dude? Who's this girl? Who's this chick? Again, much less curiosity and much more of a challenge. And that's essentially what Pharaoh is doing with Yahweh. Who's this dude that I should heed him and let Israel go? Pfft, this dude. I don't know him. No, I'm not going to let Israel go. That's the Don P translation. So again, it's not just Moses making the request, but it's Yahweh who's wanting to set his people free. And Pharaoh's response, which is this rhetorical challenge to Yahweh's authority, this question about who he is, Yahweh will respond in and through the plagues. The question of who Yahweh is, Yahweh will respond in and through the plagues. And again, this is really important for us to know, especially when it comes to how do we know who God is and the ways in which he's revealed himself. And we'll talk about that when we get back from break here in a few minutes. But before we go on break, there's one thing I want to talk about. As I mentioned before, things do not get better for the Hebrews. They find themselves being treated more harshly, working harder than before. And this confrontation that erupts in 5:22 to 23, that right there at the bottom of the screen, that then Moses turned again to the Lord and said, "Oh Lord, why have you mistreated?" Now, word in Hebrew is ra'ah, which literally means to hurt or do evil. Why have you mistreated? Why have you hurt this people? Why'd you ever send me? What was the point? Since I first came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has mistreated the exact same word that Moses accuses Yahweh of committing, this kind of mistreatment. That why have you mistreated this people and you have done nothing at all to deliver your people? That same guy who flew off the handle in chapter 2 to kill an Egyptian flies off the handle again to confront Yahweh, to tell him, you've been doing the same thing as Pharaoh in mistreating these people and not delivering the people at all. Moses accusing Yahweh of not doing a dang thing. And again, that mistreated this people. Our English Bibles often soften some of the words because it doesn't want to point us in the areas of possible heresy or some kind of like weird kind of place. But you start to see the kind of boldness that Moses has in his confrontation and complaints that prompts God to respond in chapter 6. And the reason why I want to take a pause here before we take a break is that I often think our prayer lives are much too tamed. And what I mean by that is that our approaches to prayer are often more about seemingly appeasing God's infinite wrath than pressing into God's infinite love and trusting that God sincerely wants to hear from his kids, even and especially when they're hurting. And so we don't know why Moses and God and Yahweh specifically have this kind of tight relationship, but again, this is more Partitas thinking just from reading the text and seeing these kinds of things happen, because Yahweh does respond in chapter 6. That maybe it's that kind of raw realness that Moses has with God, these kinds of accusations that Moses makes, that ends up forging so much of the tightness. And those of you that have close friendships and relationships know that there's a special kind of intimacy that is forged when you're able to be most raw, real, and vulnerable with one another. And I would fair to say that a lot of times we can float on the surface in our relationship with Jesus, relationship with God, because of either our inability or rather unwillingness to confront God in whatever ways we feel confrontation is needing to be had. And if you're needing permission, you get Partitas pastoral permission, the 3 Ps, the other 3 Ps that you don't have to memorize, but it's there. And also from the Psalms, the 4th P, to be able to bring these complaints and this realness in your prayer, in your confrontations with God, as an endeavor in faithfulness. Again, as an endeavor in faithfulness, that it's a little easier to see and experience in the context of marriage. And I hate bringing that up because that's not the only place where you can experience actual confrontation and real raw and like emotions and be able to speak honestly and truthfully. But what I fear is that the reason why the allusions, especially in church and just in general, any kind of Christian environment, to marriage become so prominent, because it's one of the few places where, at least in a somewhat solid marriage, relationship isn't threatened by confrontation and honesty. And I fear a lot of our friendships are that way, and that extends into our spiritual lives as well. That we fear sinning more than we fear being most honest and vulnerable with God. That in our honest anger, in our honest fear, in our honest anxiety, in our honest resentment with God, that we fear God's going to respond with a kind of unkindness, either based on an experience we've had in the past, where people who have responded to us harshly to our honesty, or the possibility that nobody's ever responded when we've been honest. and just expecting the same from God. And so I do want to be able to pause there, to be able to first, again, for you guys to have the permission and seeing this first in the text and from Moses specifically, and that God doesn't fly off the handle and say, Moses, you unfaithful turd. Like, why'd you say that? Why'd you accuse me of that? How could you say that? You hurt my. No, like, again, God's response to Pharaoh, it seems to maybe, again, part two is thinking. There's something to Moses' honesty that grabs God's attention and causes him to act in such a way that quite possibly he may not have acted before. And the kind of boldness that Moses has in prayer, I will tell you guys this much. Maybe it's something that ought to both encourage and challenge us, again, with the kind of rawness and realness by which can form and serve as a foundation for our own prayers that you have within the Psalms, like Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why'd you take off? Why'd you abandon me? And of course, the psalm doesn't end there, but at least the feelings and the reality of what's being felt is being communicated back to God is, why in the world did you take off on me? And again, as somebody who has suffered from abandonment and rejection, I'm real grateful for a book that not only gives me the permission to be able to speak those kinds of things, but then there's also a shared experience by the authors and the peoples throughout history that have felt a kind of abandonment, especially at the times when God was most needed. And so again, this is not to say that God abandons his people, but again, there is room when those are very real feelings and thoughts that we do have in our relationship. And again, it's not to say that God hasn't done anything, but rather, again, seeing how events are occurring, reflecting on those events, and bringing all that to prayer. Allowing that to be the place where we bring ourselves before God and confront God in the ways in which he's acting in the world. I had brought up at the start of class about how all of life is God's domain, how all the earth is part of God's domain. And this is why it's so important to have, again, the contours of Hebrew thought. It sounds super lame, but it's important for us to recognize that if there is the thought that God very much is involved with human history, when we see things occur that we're expecting and that we're, I can't seem to stop saying this word, but we're confrontational in our prayers about God acting in the world and expecting God for not only for us to speak and to participate in life, but also invite our participation, which might be the scarier thing than the actual confrontation. Because as we know, Moses will be a participant in the deliverance event. So in as much as we ought to be bold with our prayers and confrontation, we ought to be expecting that God may just may ask us to participate likewise in the things that we're asking him to do. So before we go on break, are any thoughts? I know nobody wants to be the person that makes break go. I'll give you the same amount of time for break. Don't worry about it. But again, I do want to give you guys some time to chew on this a little bit, to process it. All right. Any thoughts? Questions? Comments? All right. Well, let's go ahead. Because yeah, these are one of the things that I did want to bring up for our attention is that we've seen in Genesis already how Yahweh, the text is setting up Yahweh as the supreme God, with Genesis 1 setting up Yahweh in his temple, who's creating by speaking, and they get contrasted with other ancient Near Eastern stories and beginnings. And then how human rebellion in chapter 3 becomes an issue between God's relationship with humanity and his restorative purposes for the earth. And then how God's choosing of individuals, specifically with Abraham, becomes the means by which he then begins to restore the earth. But we see again with the Exodus how God is posed with an issue specifically with the Egyptians, but even then demonstrating to the Hebrews who are desiring, well, most specifically Moses, who's desiring to know who this God is and how God condescends to make himself known and who he is as the supreme deity and as relational deliverer, as well as making himself known to the Egyptians that he's supreme God and judge. Again, so hopefully these themes that keep coming up over and over and over again start to kind of settle as something we revisit again and again, not just as something that's fit for the Old Testament, but something that will come up again with the New Testament as we're reading it later in other classes. And so what I want us to do, let's do this. Take these passages and you take a screenshot, whatever you got to do. I'll post them in the chat, but I do want you guys to have them written down at least somewhere. And I'll go ahead and break you guys up into groups so you guys can talk about these texts. What I want you to look at and answer these questions is, who hardens Pharaoh's heart? Who hardens Pharaoh's heart? What prompts Pharaoh to harden his heart? And again, think back to our discussion on what I had said, talked about with knowing and the kind of events and the ways in which God makes himself known. And that what does this feud say about the nature and character of God, given what we just had talked about with judgment and the plagues? So again, so who hardens Pharaoh's heart? What prompts Pharaoh to harden his heart? And then what does this say? Pharaoh and the plagues. And so I'm going to stop that. And there's quite a few of you that have your cameras off. So if you do have them off, turn them on when you're in the chat room or the breakout rooms, or at least let your partners know that, hey, I'm here. I'm reading through the text with you guys. And so we'll go ahead. I'll give you guys about 8 minutes to work through these. And again, just answering who's hardening Pharaoh's heart and who's hardening Pharaoh's heart and what prompts Pharaoh's heart. So who and what? So let's go ahead and talk about it. So who hardens Pharaoh's heart? And not everybody at once.
Yahweh.
Yahweh. Okay, there's one answer.
And himself.
Who's himself?
Pharaoh.
Attaboy, there you go. So which one? Who done it? Who did it?
Both of them.
What sense do we make of the two?
Was it both of them at like the same time? So like Pharaoh's disobedience led to God having to harden his own heart, but at the same time, Pharaoh was hardening his heart. I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. And I'll elaborate more on, I think, what you're trying to get at. Because there is this kind of active response that Pharaoh has to what God is doing, which leads to the next question is what's prompting Pharaoh to harden his heart? Again, that's why I said think back to our discussion on how God is making himself known.
For that one, would it be one, because of Pharaoh's disobedience, and two, to show Pharaoh that he's not in control of everything and that God is like the Lord over everything? So kind of for God to show his dominion and sovereignty over earth.
Yeah, I think maybe what might be the better question is what is Pharaoh responding to?
Is that his that little grace period, or like after he's like relieved or whatever, respite? No.
Yeah, but what causes what causes this hardness though? I mean, there's a respite and there's all these issues that are going on, but what's causing it? Let me. So here's a few passages. There's two of them that I want to focus on specifically. And when the Lord said to Moses, when you go back to Egypt and see that you perform before Pharaoh all the signs and wonders that I have put in your power. See that you perform before Pharaoh all the signs that I've put in your power, but I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. I will harden Pharaoh's heart and I will multiply my signs and wonders. Pharaoh saw that there was a respite, there was a bit of relief. This one doesn't necessarily do it, but when Pharaoh saw that the rain and the hail and the thunder had ceased, he sinned once more and hardened his heart. What is it that is causing Pharaoh to harden his heart? And again, going back to the ways in which Israel would come to know and Egypt would come to know who Yahweh is. Hopefully that kind of serves a little bit of a helpful. What's causing part of the hardening? What causing the hardening?
That way Pharaoh doesn't take like, I guess, ownership of stopping what God is like releasing on him. It's not like, oh, I did it, I stopped it. He has like this God complex. It's more of like, oh, I can't do anything, so I'm releasing the people because that's like the only choice I have because I can't stop it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does seem to be part of the reason for release is to kind of claim back some of the territory that he seems to be losing here. But note that so often the hardening comes in the context before, after Yahweh has committed an activity that demonstrates Pharaoh's inability to act, often by his own magicians. That there's somebody new in town who's controlling all this, which again, that there was a respite, he hardened his heart after the rain and the hail and the thunder had ceased. And so I think, again, to go back what you had brought up, Denny, of what's going on between Pharaoh hardened his heart and who done it. It's this response that Pharaoh is having to Yahweh's delivering activity. The response that Pharaoh is having in response to Yahweh's delivering activity. And this happens a lot. And you'll see the phrase, the hardening of hearts, that comes up. And that's often what the response is, again, to God actively doing something. It happens to the Pharisees in the New Testament, but then it also happens to Israel and what the prophets are calling for when they're hardening their hearts over and against what God is doing, again, through his divine initiative. And there's two ways to interpret this kind of phrase, this hardening of hearts, because the plagues are intertwined in this conflict between Pharaoh and Yahweh, where Yahweh is demonstrating his superiority over both Pharaoh and the deities that are active or thought to be active in Egypt. At this hardening of heart, and you'll know from your cultures class that Pharaoh is in charge of keeping ma'at, or keeping order, and that ma'at is essential for life, for preservation, for order to be created and upheld, and that not keeping ma'at Not keeping order would weigh down Pharaoh's heart. And thus, Pharaoh's heart being hardened means him being weighed down by injustice. It was not right for Pharaoh to continue to hold on to the people despite the forces, what you might say the forces, demanding that they would be let go. And this causes a lack of order or disorder, and this inability to maintain created order would weigh down his heart, and thus Pharaoh cannot enter into immortality. That what would happen, again, in Egyptian mythology is that after death, Pharaoh would be brought before a judge, and his heart would be weighed against a feather. If Pharaoh's heart was heavier than a feather, then he would be committed. He would be committed to death and not enter into immortality. And so this very much fits into, again, Pharaoh's interests of maintaining order, but despite his ability to not maintain it, thus his heart is weighed down, made heavy, because that's what it means in Hebrew, that Pharaoh's heart was made heavy. Another way to interpret this is a kind of unwillingness to listen, that the heart is seen as the kind of center of life, of existence, and thus to harden one's heart is to close off oneself to fear or wisdom that God gives, which leads to disaster. And again, I offer up multiple interpretations, even though I have one that I have more stock in, even though, again, both of them are legitimate and do have their case within historical literary criticism, that they both make sense within the story. But again, this one tends to be the one I lean more towards, because again, one, it assumes it makes better use of Hebrew language and ideology, but then also, again, it's more consistent within the text, even though, again, the hardening of Pharaoh's heart still makes sense as getting heavy. But again, this unwillingness to listen, that it's both an initial decision and continued response. When we ask who is hardening Pharaoh's heart, and the thought that it's both, that again, it's both response and continued response. It's initial response, decision, and continued response. It's a decision Pharaoh makes and continues to make over and again and again and again, because of God's responsive activity in delivering his people by way of the plagues. This was the way that Yahweh responds to the question, who is the Lord? Yahweh, out of his kindness and mercy, tongue in cheek there, but it's Yahweh's responding to Pharaoh's question, is that rhetorical challenge of who is the Lord. And this is the way that he's responding as, again, supreme deity and judge. But it's Pharaoh who wants his own will done to the demise of his people and his own family. And why? That it's the Lord who tells Moses, it's Yahweh who tells Moses to go to Pharaoh because his heart has been hardened. But there's three things that is meant to be remembered by way of the deliverance after the plagues, because after the death of the firstborn, and we'll talk about that next week, because then that'll take us into the actual Exodus event and then to Mount Sinai. That the Lord is a dangerous and powerful redeemer of the oppressed. I hate that it says power redeemer. The Lord is a dangerous and powerful redeemer of the oppressed. And that the Lord is creator of the entire creation. And again, this tugs on your cultures class again in talking about local deities and how their power was limited to a specific region, but that rather Yahweh is Lord over all creation, not just a specific region, not just the land flowing with milk and honey, not just of Canaan. And that Yahweh is ultimately in control of all. And that for the Hebrews, that this is a story that they must tell the world of how God redeemed and recreated the Hebrews. of taking a people who were once in captivity, bringing them out from the hand of the oppressors and bringing them into a good and broad land. And again, these will be three things that will be commended to them to be reminded as they're going from the land of Egypt into the promised land. And their ability to remember these things will mean their success or their demise. And what I mean by success is they're living in the land, being in the land. Why? Again, so that they would know that this God, our Elohim, is Yahweh. The same one who spoke to their ancestors has now made himself known to the Hebrews despite the oppressive, brutal conditions in which they once lived. That God is Savior and Redeemer of this people. And so again, it's through these events that Yahweh makes himself known. And then ultimately will make himself known by the deliverance from Egypt. So one more time, Yahweh's going to tell Moses, and then Moses is going to pass it along to Pharaoh and everybody in Pharaoh's house that there's going to be one more plague that's coming. But, as always has been the but since Moses first started talking to Pharaoh, that Moses will not be listened to in order that Yahweh's wonders may be multiplied in the land of Egypt. And so the last verse down there, that the Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh will not listen to you in order that my wonders may be multiplied in the land of Egypt. And Moses and Aaron performed all these wonders before Pharaoh, but the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he did not let the people of Israel go out of his land. And so this then will prompt the very last plague, which the death of the firstborn. Again, we'll talk about that for next week since we're kind of up against time here. This will prompt the last plague, which finally is the kind of the camel that breaks the Pharaoh's back. I know it's the straw that breaks the camel's back, but I just did it the other way. The straw that breaks Pharaoh's back. And we'll talk about it next week. It's not easy to talk about it all. But God being who he is, Yahweh being who he is, communicates to Pharaoh in language in which he understood. And the violence of a culture, while no means justifiable or tasteful to our modern tastes, is language that is easily identified by Pharaoh, which is why he lets the people go. But again, you have these kind of 9 signs of grace that are meant to serve as warnings to let the people go, but yet Pharaoh refuses. Out of fear and paranoia, refuses to let the people go. And so you see a kind of hesitation and willingness for Yahweh to condescend, or not condescend, but to devolve into such actions, but yet chooses to do so in order to liberate his people. And so again, it's difficult to talk about, but we'll talk about death of the firstborn next week. But are there any questions, comments, concerns, regrets, anxieties, doubts, insecurities? None. Christian shake your head. Nope, not one. All right. Well, if there's no questions, again, I'll be here for a few minutes after class if you have any questions. You guys have an absolutely beautiful week. I'll be communicating with you guys again later this week, but just as a reminder, the worksheet for next week is extra credit. Hopefully that alleviates some of the burdens off you guys, being more like Yahweh than Pharaoh by alleviating your burdens and not trying to put more on you than you're able to bear. So again, just to help you guys focus on the Exodus survey. Yeah, again, if you guys have any questions, I'm around, and if you guys need to meet up, let me know. Again, office hours this week, Tuesday and Thursday, 2 to 4 p.m. on the Zoom over here. So you guys, if you guys don't have anything, I'll see you guys next week. It always feels too long, but guess what are we gonna do? All right, see you guys.